What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession, a couple of hundred pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them. A lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. Operation Midnight Climax. The government hired sex workers to dose Johns with LSD for research purposes, so to speak. CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. One US bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb a short distance from a major US city, can't remember which, but luckily it didn't detonate off the coast of Georgia. They still haven't found it. No, they know exactly where it is. It would just be more dangerous to retrieve it than to just leave it alone. It's off the coast of Savannah. My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project. Then we wonder why cancer and thyroid conditions there are the norm. There are over 50 mishaps with nuclear weapons by the US Air Force in the 1950s alone. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through the 1970s. Kinda sobering knowing that we were using tax dollars to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against US civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. CIA invested millions trying to make cat spies. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware, as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. As a part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those only a few were implanted. The ones which were would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them that next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. If you want to read all about it and other things that the US and governments around the world are up to from the horse's mouth, I highly recommend theblackvault.com, the website of /u/blackvault. Here's 100-ish pages of what I described above, helpfully foiled and archived thanks to his hard work. Added for some bright side, via the same source we get remote control of war dogs, remotely controlled scout dog, June 1974, wherein we learn that we can just train dogs. They respond to audio and visual cues, and can be trained to turn on command at long distances by playing a tone over the radio. New Zealand's UFO files are a bit creepy. I was in the library and stumbled across the bound files. There's a lot of assumed crazy people being crazy, but there's also one specific one that stood out from respectable Air Force pilots who were both in the air, conducted mini tests, for example blinking, moving the plane in relation to the object, verifying what he saw with the co-pilot to ensure it wasn't an illusion or his mind. I don't know, just the fact that you'd assume he wasn't crazy creeps me out so much. MKUltra. Partially illegal, forced mind control experiments utilizing psychoactive drugs, conducted by the CIA in 1950s/60s. Canadian here. The Somalia affair, not sure if it was ever classified, but definitely a horrific scandal. A now disbanded division of the Canadian military torturing a kid to death in the 90s, and taking hero pics with him while doing it. I think it's important to remember when your country does something shitty, it's not always the bad guys who can be fucking evil. Surprised no one has mentioned the Panama Papers. They've been out for a while, but there's been little coverage of them. TLDR of them, lots of money laundering that was tracked pointed to major governments and global businesses. Edit, Amazon Prime has a series called The Giant Beast that is the global economy. They talk about the Panama Papers in a couple episodes. Can't remember the source, but apparently there is a legit order signed by Hitler to his nuclear researchers saying if they have a viable nuclear explosive, start loading into V2s immediately. Devil Eyes. The plan after 9/11 to make figurines that look like Osama bin Laden and give them to kids in South Asia. After it's left in the sun for a certain amount of time, its face would peel off to reveal a demon-like visage with red skin, green eyes, and black markings, basically a demon. The objective was to scare kids and their parents so bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would lose support. COINTELPRO. Really sickening how the FBI took down the civil rights movement. Framed, blackmailed and even killed various leaders. One that is not US. There was an episode of Radiolab that talks about an enormous secret facility in Britain that houses the British Empire's secret archives. The way they describe it, it sounds like the place where the Ark of the Covenant is stored at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. What they uncover in the episode is the human rights atrocities that were committed by British troops during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya during the 1950s. There were details in the uncovered documents about detention camps and torture that occurred during the conflict. It gave grounds for surviving Mau Mau to seek compensation against the Crown in recent years. The atrocities of the conflict were not widely known about until recently. This isn't really a classified document, but at one point the US government was telling people to build your own bomb shelter to protect your family. And it showed how to dig a 8-foot by 4-foot by 10-foot hole in your backyard, and if there is a nuclear threat, to get your family and go in there and cover it with a door. So obviously that wouldn't really protect anyone in the case of a nuclear attack. Later it came out that the purpose of telling families to do that was so if there was a nuclear attack on American soil, they wouldn't have to bury as many bodies because the families dug their own grave. So yeah. Not classified, but along the same disturbing stuff the US government did. Not really terrifying but fucked up, Operation Paperclip. Where after World War II the US government took Nazi scientists and shipped them to America to do science. Some of them came straight from Nuremberg cells. The most noteworthy being Werner von Braun. Von Braun built the V2 rockets with Jewish slave labor. Every day they would execute the 5 slowest workers in front of the other workers to incentive them to work harder. Once he came to America, we shipped him to Huntsville, Alabama, where he built the Saturn V, the rocket used in the Apollo program, and got us to the moon. I remember something about a heart attack gun I read some time ago. Basically a poison gun that once shot is untraceable in the victim's body and leaves no mark on their body. Sorry if it sounds really vague. Right now there's a radioactive pile of trash in St. Louis and the surrounding rivers, which got infected with all the rain washing away the radioactive trash into the rivers, gave cancer to many people since the 1950s. When they performed a lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy, due to her being intellectually disabled. At 23 years of age her father arranged a prefrontal lobotomy. At the time the procedure had only been done about 100 times in US. It failed, leaving her unable to speak intelligibly and incapacitated. She was conscious during the operation. They say that the neurosurgeons or whatever they're called ask the patient to count from 10 to know when they should stop cutting down. I've heard that they stopped when her speech was incoherent. Saddest thing is that she had to endure it for 64 years. All that because her family couldn't risk any political embarrassment. I notice this is more disturbing than terrifying, but I think it fits. This is a rabbit hole of a case, only partially classified by the CIA until information was released 3 years after initial capture. Robert Levinson, former FBI agent, retired and began working as a private investigator, specializing in Russian crime circles. Levinson traveled to the Persian Gulf's Kish Island, which had fewer restrictions on American passports due to being a free trade zone, to enter Iran. He was last seen March 9, 2007. For 3 years after his disappearance, the US government was adamant that he was not acting with a government party, only private eye work. After 3 years, it was confirmed that Levinson was acting as part of the CIA on an unauthorized mission to gather data on an Iranian regime. He has had a proof of life appearance in 2010. Levinson has 7 kids, one of which with his mom, that have traveled to Iran find their dad and husband, only to be shown plain manifestos by Iranian officials, suggesting that Levinson had left. As of 2013, if he's still alive, Levinson is the longest held American captive at 12 years. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.